After I tragically lost my pregnancy, my mother-in-law had the audacity to tell me it was my own fault, blaming my negative attitude and supposed lack of faith in God's plan, as if grief wasn't enough. My world shattered the day I lost my baby, but what came next was an unthinkable betrayal. Imagine being blamed for your own child's death, not by a stranger, but by the very people who should have held you closest. And then, when you're at your lowest, being told your grief itself is a spiritual failing. This isn't just a story about loss. It's about a mother-in-law's cruel judgment, a husband's heartbreaking silence, and the moment I realized I had to fight for my own sanity, even if it meant walking away from everything. I'm Serenity, and I work as a librarian. My husband, Bartholomew, is a high school history teacher. We'd been married for 2 years and were finally pregnant last spring after 8 months of trying. His mother, Temperance, a church secretary, had been a member of her large evangelical church for over 30 years. From the moment we announced our pregnancy, Temperance made it crystal clear that she had very specific ideas about how I should carry her future grandchild. She genuinely believed pregnancy should be a time of pure joy and unwavering faith, and that any hint of worry or anxiety showed a complete lack of trust in divine providence. "The Lord will take care of everything," she declared. Whenever I dared to mention normal pregnancy concerns like morning sickness or just feeling utterly exhausted, women who truly trust in His plan don't spend their time worrying about every little thing. This attitude became a massive problem almost immediately. Around 8 weeks, I was hit with morning sickness so severe I couldn't keep anything down. My obstetrician, Dr. Ashworth, was actually worried about my weight loss and was considering medication to help. When I cautiously brought this up to Temperance at a family dinner, her response was instant and cutting. "In my day, women didn't need medication for morning sickness," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "We just trusted that our bodies knew what they were doing, and that the Lord would see us through." I tried to explain. "The doctor is concerned about dehydration and weight loss. She just wants to make sure the baby is getting enough nutrients." But she just doubled down. Doctors today create problems where none exist. They make women anxious about perfectly normal processes. If you just had more faith and stopped worrying so much, your body would settle down naturally. The worst part? Bartholomew, my own husband, often sided with his mother. He'd been raised in her church, sharing so many of her beliefs. "Maybe Mom has a point," he said after that dinner. "You do seem pretty stressed about the pregnancy. Maybe if you tried to relax more and trust that things will work out, you'd feel better physically too." His words stung. It felt like he was saying my very real medical concerns were just a sign of my insufficient faith. But I was too utterly exhausted from constant nausea to even argue. I just hoped that once the first trimester ended, both the symptoms and the family tensions would magically disappear. But things only got worse. At 12 weeks, routine blood work showed I had developed gestational diabetes. This meant constant monitoring of my diet and blood sugar. Dr. Ashworth referred me to a specialist, explaining how serious this was for both me and the baby. "We'll need to track your glucose levels closely and possibly start insulin if diet modifications aren't enough," she explained. Gestational diabetes increases the risk of various complications, so we want to be proactive about management. My life became a whirlwind of testing my blood sugar multiple times a day, following a strict diet, and endless specialist appointments. When I explained all this to Temperance, her reaction was exactly what I dreaded. Completely unsympathetic. "Gestational diabetes is what happens when women don't take proper care of themselves during pregnancy," she declared, as if it were a moral failing. "If you'd been eating right and trusting the Lord instead of stressing about every little thing, this wouldn't have happened." I tried to correct her. The doctor said it's not caused by diet or stress. It's hormonal changes, and some women are just more susceptible. But she just wouldn't listen. Doctors will tell you anything to avoid taking responsibility for creating problems through all their testing and interventions. Women in my generation didn't get all these complicated diagnoses because we trusted our bodies and our faith. The conversation spiraled when Temperance actually suggested I stop seeing the specialists and just pray for healing. "All this medical interference is creating more stress and complications," she insisted. "If you just trusted that the Lord would take care of you and the baby, these problems would resolve themselves." And Bartholomew's response? It was a punch to the gut. Instead of supporting my need for medical care, he actually suggested we consider his mother's perspective. "I'm not saying we should ignore medical advice completely," he said, "but maybe we're overthinking this. Mom successfully had 3 healthy children without all these specialists and interventions." I looked at him, disbelief washing over me. "Bartholomew, I have a medical condition that needs to be managed. This isn't about faith versus medicine. It's about following medical recommendations to keep both me and the baby healthy. But he just wouldn't get it. I understand that, but I also think Mom might be right that stress and anxiety can make medical problems worse. Maybe if you approach this with more faith and less worry, your body would respond better. That conversation revealed a deep, fundamental disconnect. He truly seemed to believe that my concern was causing the problems, while I knew medical monitoring was essential. The situation only intensified. At 16 weeks, an ultrasound showed the baby was measuring smaller than expected, likely due to the diabetes. Dr. Ashworth increased my monitoring appointments and even discussed the possibility of an early delivery. "We're going to watch this very closely," she explained. "Sometimes with gestational diabetes, babies don't grow properly, and we may need to intervene if the situation worsens." The news was terrifying. I left the appointment feeling utterly anxious about my baby's health. When I shared this with Bartholomew and Temperance, their responses were the exact opposite of what I needed. "See, this is exactly what I've been talking about," Temperance immediately crowed. "All this medical testing and monitoring is creating problems that wouldn't exist if you just trusted the natural process." "The doctor isn't creating problems," I retorted, exhausted by the endless argument. "She's identifying issues that need to be addressed to keep the baby safe." "No," she countered. "She's making you anxious and fearful, which is affecting the baby's development. Babies can sense their mother's stress and anxiety. If you were more peaceful and trusting, the baby would grow normally." "And Bartholomew?" He just nodded along with his mother. "I have to admit, Serenity, you've been pretty worried throughout this pregnancy. Maybe that stress is affecting your health and the baby's growth." The suggestion that my concern for my baby's well-being was somehow causing complications was devastating. I felt like I was being blamed for medical conditions completely beyond my control, and that my husband cared more about his mother's opinions than my actual medical needs. Then, at 17 weeks, I started cramping and spotting. It sent me straight to the emergency room. The on-call doctor, Dr. Montgomery, found that while the baby's heartbeat was strong, I was showing signs of cervical changes that could mean preterm labor. "We're going to admit you for observation and start medications to try to prevent labor from progressing," Dr. Montgomery explained. "Sometimes these symptoms resolve with rest and treatment, but we need to monitor you closely." I spent 3 agonizing days in the hospital. The cramping eventually subsided, and the cervical changes stabilized. The medical team was cautiously optimistic, but they stressed that I would need strict bed rest for the rest of my pregnancy. "You'll need to limit your activities significantly," Dr. Ashworth told me when I was discharged. "No work, minimal household tasks, and lots of rest. We want to give the baby as much time as possible to develop before delivery." Bed rest meant unpaid leave from my job and relying heavily on Bartholomew for everything. It also meant being stuck at home, which of course meant even more exposure to Temperance's opinions. "All this bed rest nonsense is exactly what I'm talking about," she declared during one of her daily visits. "Women used to work right up until delivery, and their babies were fine. All this medical paranoia is making you weaker, not stronger." I tried to explain from my spot on the couch. "The doctors are trying to prevent premature birth. If I go into labor now, the baby's lungs won't be developed enough to survive outside the womb." Her response was chilling. "That's what doctors want you to believe, so they can control every aspect of your pregnancy. Women's bodies know what they're doing. If the baby was meant to be born early, that would be part of the Lord's plan." Her suggestion that my baby dying prematurely could be part of the Lord's plan was deeply, deeply disturbing, especially when the medical team was fighting so hard to prevent it. The crisis hit at 18 weeks and 2 days. I woke up with severe cramping and heavy bleeding. It was different. Bartholomew rushed me to the emergency room. Dr. Montgomery performed an ultrasound immediately. The baby's heartbeat was gone. The next few hours were a blur of medical procedures, explanations, and arrangements for the delivery of our daughter, who we named Hope. The medical team explained that sometimes, despite everything, pregnancy loss just happens. "There was nothing you could have done differently," Dr. Ashworth assured me later. "Your gestational diabetes was well controlled. You followed all the bed rest recommendations, and you received excellent medical care. Sometimes these losses happen due to chromosomal abnormalities or other factors that we can't predict or prevent." The grief was overwhelming. Losing Hope at 18 weeks meant I had felt her move. We had chosen her name. We had started planning for her arrival. The physical recovery was complicated by the sheer emotional trauma. Bartholomew was devastated too, and for the first few days we clung to each other. He took time off work to be with me. But then Temperance arrived, supposedly to support us, and the dynamic shifted completely. I know this is difficult, she said on her first visit after the loss. But you need to understand that this happened for a reason. The Lord sometimes calls babies home early when they're not meant for this world. The idea that Hope's death was somehow predestined was hurtful, but I was too fragile to argue. I just don't understand why this happened. I sobbed. We did everything the doctors recommended. That's exactly the problem, Temperance replied with disturbing confidence. You spent this entire pregnancy worried and anxious instead of trusting in the Lord's plan. All that stress and negativity affected the baby's development. I stared at her in shock. Are you saying that my attitude caused it? I'm saying that when women don't have faith and spend their pregnancies worrying about every little thing, it affects their bodies and their babies. If you trusted the Lord and stayed positive instead of focusing on all those medical problems, this might not have happened. The sheer cruelty of blaming me for Hope's death, while I was still physically and emotionally recovering, was breathtaking. I started crying harder, which only seemed to irritate Temperance. See, this is what I'm talking about, she continued. Instead of accepting that this was part of the Lord's will and finding peace in that, you're dwelling on grief and making yourself more upset. My baby died, I sobbed. Of course I'm upset. But staying upset and refusing to trust that the Lord knows best is exactly the kind of negative attitude that probably contributed to this situation in the first place. At that point I asked her to leave, but she refused, saying she was there to help me work through my grief in a healthy way. When Bartholomew came home and found me crying while his mother continued her lecture, I expected him to step in to defend me. Instead, he sat down and listened to his mother's explanation of her concerns about my spiritual response to the loss. I'm worried that Serenity isn't processing this grief in a healthy way, Temperance told him. She's focusing on all the medical explanations instead of accepting that this was part of the Lord's plan. If she doesn't learn to trust His will, she'll just make herself sick with all this negativity. And Bartholomew's reply? I understand your concern, Mom. Maybe we should think about how to help Serenity find some peace through faith. The fact that he was discussing me like I wasn't even there, considering his mother's suggestion that my grief was spiritually deficient, was devastating. Bartholomew, I said, my voice trembling, your mother just told me that my attitude caused our baby's death. Are you going to let her say that to me while I'm grieving our daughter? I don't think Mom meant it like that, he said carefully. I think she's just trying to help you find a way to cope that doesn't involve so much anger and sadness. I lost my baby 6 days ago. Anger and sadness are normal parts of grief. But dwelling on those emotions isn't healthy, Temperance interjected. You need to find peace in knowing that hope is with the Lord now, and that everything happens according to His plan. I need to grieve my daughter without being told that it's my fault she died. I replied. Nobody's saying it's your fault, Bartholomew said, though that was exactly what his mother had implied. We're just saying that finding faith and acceptance might help you heal faster than staying angry at the doctors or the situation. The conversation made it painfully clear. Both Bartholomew and Temperance saw my grief as something to be managed and redirected, rather than simply supported. They cared more about my spiritual response than my emotional well-being. The 2 weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. It wasn't just the grief over hope. It was the relentless family conflict about how I was supposed to process it. Temperance started visiting daily, supposedly for support, but really to monitor my spiritual progress and offer endless unsolicited advice. She brought religious books, scripture verses, and stories about other women who had overcome pregnancy loss through faith. Sister Margaret from our church lost 3 babies before she had her son, Temperance told me during one visit. But she never let herself get bitter or angry. She trusted that the Lord had a plan, and eventually He blessed her with a healthy child. The implication that my grief was a form of bitterness that would prevent future blessings was incredibly cruel. I was still physically recovering, still emotionally processing, but Temperance expected me to have already achieved some state of spiritual acceptance. I'm not ready to think about future pregnancies, I told her. I'm still grieving this baby. But that's exactly the problem, she replied. If you keep focusing on what you lost instead of trusting that the Lord has better plans for you, you'll stay stuck in this negative mindset. Grieving my daughter isn't a negative mindset. It's a normal response to loss. Grief is normal for a little while, but prolonged sadness and anger show a lack of faith. You need to choose to trust that Hope's death was part of a larger plan that you can't understand right now. These daily lectures about the spiritual deficiencies of my grief were making my recovery immeasurably harder. Instead of processing my loss, I was constantly defending my right to feel sad. The situation worsened when Temperance started involving other church members in her campaign. She invited women from her Bible study group to visit me, ostensibly for support, but actually to reinforce her message. "We've been praying for you," said Charity, one of Temperance's friends. "The Lord told us that you're struggling with acceptance, and that you need help releasing your anger." "I'm not angry," I replied. "I'm sad. My baby died. But the Lord doesn't want you to stay sad." Another woman, Patience, added, "He wants you to find joy in knowing that hope is safe with him now." The expectation that I should feel joyful about my daughter's death was deeply disturbing. But these women genuinely believed my sadness was a spiritual failing. "Maybe you should consider talking to Pastor Goodwin," Charity suggested. "He's helped many women work through the spiritual challenges of pregnancy loss." When I mentioned this to Bartholomew, he thought it was a great idea. "Pastor Goodwin is really wise," he said. "Maybe talking to him would help you find some peace." "I don't need spiritual counseling," I replied. "I need time to grieve and support from my family." But he just kept pushing. "Maybe Mom's right that you're getting stuck in grief instead of moving toward healing. Talking to Pastor Goodwin might help you process everything in a more positive way." It was becoming painfully clear that Bartholomew viewed my grief as something negative that needed to be corrected, rather than a natural response that needed to be supported. He was more concerned with his mother's assessment of my spiritual condition than my actual emotional needs. The breaking point came when I discovered Temperance had been telling people at her church that my negative attitude during pregnancy had contributed to Hope's death. This came from my own mother, Virginia, who heard it from a friend. "Serenity, I think you need to know what Bartholomew's mother is saying about you," my mother told me, her voice filled with concern. "She's been telling people that you didn't have enough faith during your pregnancy, and that your worry and stress caused the baby's death." The betrayal of having my grief and loss turned into church gossip was devastating. Not only was Temperance blaming me, but she was spreading that blame throughout her entire social circle. "She's telling people that modern women don't know how to trust the Lord during pregnancy, and that you're an example of what happens when medical interventions replace faith," my mother continued. "She's using your loss as a teaching moment about spiritual deficiency." When I confronted Bartholomew about his mother's public blame campaign, his response was disappointing but not surprising. "I'm sure Mom doesn't mean it like that," he said. "She's probably just trying to help other women avoid the same kind of stress and anxiety that you experienced. She's telling people that my attitude killed our baby." I replied, my voice rising. "How is that helping anyone? Maybe she's just trying to emphasize the importance of staying positive during pregnancy. You did worry a lot about the medical complications." "I worried about legitimate medical conditions that required monitoring and treatment. That's not the same as having a bad attitude." "I know, but maybe there's some truth to the idea that stress can affect pregnancy outcomes. Maybe if you'd been more relaxed and trusting, things might have been different." The fact that Bartholomew was willing to entertain the possibility that my concern for my baby's health had somehow caused her death was the final straw. I realized he fundamentally agreed with his mother's assessment that I was spiritually and emotionally deficient, and that he would never provide the support I needed to heal. That night, I called my mother and asked if I could come stay with her. "Of course, sweetheart," she said immediately. "You need to be around people who love and support you, not people who blame you for something that wasn't your fault." I packed a bag, leaving Bartholomew a note explaining that I needed space from his family's blame and judgment. I told him that when he was ready to support me as his wife, rather than defend his mother's cruel opinions, we could discuss my return. I've been staying with my mother for 3 weeks now, and the difference in my emotional well-being has been dramatic. Being away from Temperance's daily lectures and Bartholomew's constant suggestions that my grief needed correction has allowed me to actually begin processing Hope's death in a healthy way. My mother has been incredibly supportive, allowing me to cry, talk about Hope, and simply exist in my grief without judgment or pressure to move on. "Grief isn't something you get over," she told me. "It's something you learn to carry, and everyone carries it differently." The contrast with Temperance's approach couldn't be starker. Where Temperance demanded immediate spiritual acceptance, my mother simply provided space for me to feel whatever I was feeling. Dr. Ashworth referred me to a grief counselor, Dr. Ophelia Sinclair, who specializes in pregnancy and infant loss. Our sessions have been incredibly helpful in validating my experience. "Your grief is not a spiritual failing," Dr. Sinclair assured me. "Losing a baby is one of the most traumatic experiences a person can endure, and there's no correct way to respond to that trauma." She also helped me understand that Temperance's blame was a form of secondary trauma. When people blame grieving parents for their loss, it creates additional trauma on top of the original loss, she explained. "You're not just processing Hope's death. You're also processing the betrayal and blame from people who should be supporting you." Through therapy, I've come to understand that Temperance's behavior isn't about faith. It's about her need to control and feel superior. Blaming you for Hope's death allows her to believe that she would never experience such a loss because of her superior faith and attitude, Dr. Sinclair explained. Some people can't tolerate the randomness and unfairness of tragedy, so they create narratives that make them feel safer, even if those narratives harm others. The therapy also helped me recognize that Bartholomew's inability to support me wasn't just about his mother. It was about his fundamental beliefs about women, faith, and family. During my time away, Bartholomew called several times, asking when I was coming home and insisting we could work through our differences. "Mom feels terrible that you misunderstood her intentions," he said during one call. "She was just trying to help you find peace through faith." "I didn't misunderstand anything," I replied. "She blamed me for Hope's death and told people at church that my attitude caused it. She's clarified that she didn't mean it like that. She was just emphasizing the importance of staying positive during pregnancy. Bartholomew, our baby died. Your mother told me it was because I didn't have enough faith. How can you defend that?" "I'm not defending it, but I think you're interpreting her words in the worst possible way. She loves you and wants to help you heal." The fact that he continued to characterize Temperance's cruelty as misunderstood love showed that nothing had changed. He still prioritized his mother's feelings over my experience. The most revealing conversation came when he suggested I should apologize to Temperance for overreacting. "She's been really hurt by your response," he said. "She feels like you've rejected her attempts to help, and she's worried that you're not healing properly. She should be worried about the fact that she blamed the grieving mother for her baby's death." I replied, "But maybe if you could see past the way she said it to what she was trying to communicate, you could find some value in her perspective. What value is there in being told that my attitude killed my daughter? The value of understanding that staying positive and having faith can be important parts of healing." That conversation made it crystal clear. Bartholomew would never acknowledge his mother's cruelty or prioritize my emotional needs over her feelings. He was asking me to apologize for being hurt by someone who blamed me for my baby's death. That's when I made the gut-wrenching decision to file for separation. My attorney, Prudence Whitfield, helped me understand my options. Since we'd been married for less than 3 years and had no surviving children, the process was relatively straightforward. "You have grounds for emotional cruelty," Attorney Whitfield explained. "The failure to support you during pregnancy loss and the family's blame campaign could constitute emotional abuse. But I wasn't interested in a contentious divorce. I just wanted to end the marriage and move forward." When I served Bartholomew with separation papers, his response was immediate and predictable. He called his mother, who then launched a campaign to convince our mutual friends and family that I was having some kind of breakdown. "Serenity isn't thinking clearly because of grief," she told anyone who would listen. "She's making irrational decisions and blaming innocent people for her loss." Her narrative was that I was mentally unstable, and my decision to leave was proof of my inability to process Hope's death healthily. Several of our friends received calls from Temperance, asking them to intervene and convince me to return to Bartholomew. Fortunately, most of our friends saw through her manipulation. My best friend from college, Melody, was particularly direct. "That woman is toxic," she said after receiving one of Temperance's calls. "The fact that she blamed you for losing hope, and is now trying to convince people you're crazy for leaving shows exactly who she is." My sister Harmony had a similar response. "She tried to tell me that you were having a breakdown and needed family intervention," Harmony reported. "When I told her that you seemed healthier and more stable than you'd been in months, she got angry and said I was enabling your destructive behavior." 6 months have passed since I left Bartholomew, and I wanted to share a final update because the long-term consequences of this situation have been both validating and surprisingly empowering. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago. Bartholomew initially contested it, claiming I was making decisions based on grief-induced mental instability. But when his attorney reviewed the evidence of Temperance's behavior and his own recorded statements supporting her blame campaign, they advised him to accept my terms. "Your ex-husband's family created extensive documentation of their own inappropriate behavior," Attorney Whitfield observed dryly. "Between the recorded phone calls where they blamed you for the miscarriage and the witness statements about the church gossip campaign, they essentially built our case for us." The most significant development came when Pastor Goodwin, the minister at Temperance's church, contacted me directly to apologize. "I became aware of what Mrs. Temperance was saying about your pregnancy loss, and I want you to know that her statements don't represent our church's teachings about grief and loss," he said during our phone conversation. Apparently, several church members had been disturbed by Temperance's public blame campaign and had brought their concerns to him. When he investigated, He discovered she'd been using Hope's death as a cautionary tale about insufficient faith for months. Blaming bereaved parents for their losses is contrary to everything we believe about compassion and support, Pastor Goodwin explained. I've had extensive conversations with Mrs. Temperance about her statements, and she's been asked to step down from her position as church secretary. The fact that Temperance's own church found her behavior inappropriate was deeply validating. It confirmed that her cruelty wasn't genuine religious belief, but her personal need to blame and control others. Pastor Goodwin also shared that several families had left the church specifically because of Temperance's judgmental attitude. We've lost 3 families in the past year who felt unwelcome because of her responses to their struggles, he said. Your situation was the final straw that forced us to address her behavior. The church's response had significant social consequences for Temperance. Being asked to step down was deeply embarrassing, and several of her close friends began distancing themselves from her toxic attitudes. Meanwhile, my relationship with Bartholomew's siblings has been surprising. His brother, Phineas, and sister Charity both reached out to apologize for not speaking up. We knew Mom was being inappropriate, but we were afraid to confront her, Phineas admitted during a coffee meeting. Watching what she did to you made us realize how destructive her behavior has become. Both siblings had their own stories about Temperance's judgmental responses to their difficulties over the years. They'd learned to avoid sharing problems with her because she inevitably found ways to blame them. She told Charity that her divorce was caused by insufficient prayer, and told me that my son's learning disability was the result of not raising him with enough faith, Phineas explained. We should have spoken up when she started blaming you for Hope's death. The most unexpected development was learning that Temperance had driven away multiple potential daughters-in-law over the years through similar behavior. Bartholomew's previous girlfriend left him because of Mom, Charity revealed. She was dealing with depression, and Mom kept telling her that mental illness was a spiritual failing that could be cured through prayer. This pattern of destroying her son's relationships helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique. It was Temperance's established method of maintaining control. As for Bartholomew, I heard through mutual friends that he's struggled significantly since our divorce. The loss of hope combined with the end of our marriage has apparently forced him to confront some difficult truths about his family dynamics. He's been going to individual therapy, Melody reported after running into him. He told me he's trying to understand how he failed to support you during the worst time of your life. While I appreciate that he's seeking help, the damage to our relationship was too severe for reconciliation. The fact that he defended his mother's cruelty, while I was grieving our daughter, revealed fundamental incompatibilities in our values. My healing process has been supported by an amazing community of women who've experienced similar losses. Dr. Sinclair connected me with a support group for pregnancy and infant loss, where I've met other mothers who truly understand this unique pain. The isolation that bereaved mothers experience is often made worse by people who don't understand grief, explained Isabella, another group member. Having people who get it makes all the difference. The group has also helped me understand that Temperance's response, while particularly cruel, is unfortunately not uncommon. Many women shared stories about family members or religious communities that blamed them for their losses or pressured them to get over it. Society is very uncomfortable with pregnancy loss, Dr. Sinclair explained during one of our group sessions. People create explanations that make them feel safer, even if those explanations harm the grieving parents. I've also become involved in advocacy work, helping the hospital where I delivered hope develop resources for families, focusing on appropriate support strategies and harmful responses to avoid. Your experience with blame and judgment, while traumatic for you, has helped us create much better family education materials, Dr. Ashworth told me. As for my personal life, I'm doing well. I've returned to work at the library, where my colleagues have been incredibly supportive. I've also started dating someone wonderful, Felix, a social worker who understands trauma and loss from his professional experience. I'm sorry that people failed you when you needed support most, he said when I told him about Hope and the family situation. But I'm grateful that you're strong enough to have survived it and built this new life. Hope will always be part of my story, and I'll always grieve the daughter I lost. But I've learned that grief and healing aren't mutually exclusive, and that it's possible to honor a lost child while still building a meaningful future. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my own experience and judgment, rather than allowing others to define my emotional responses. Temperance's attempt to blame me for Hope's death was cruel and wrong, but it ultimately led me to discover my own strength, and to surround myself with people who truly understand love and support.